It was an ordinary spring morning in 1983. Inside the small guest house on the edge of Prescott Valley, Arizona, the quiet hum of Emma's routine filled the rooms. She was 32, steady in her movements, wiping the window panes and folding the linens she had washed the night before. The day had just begun, the desert light sharp and pale through the curtains. By 8 o'clock, she had finished the morning chores. She set the kettle on the stove, ready to make tea before heading into town for cleaning supplies. The Graysons, the elderly couple she worked for, heard her humming softly from the kitchen. Then the sound stopped. Hours passed. The tea never brewed. The house stayed too quiet. Mrs. Grayson assumed Emma had stepped out to buy soap or polish. But by noon she had not returned. The table was still set for lunch. The mail at the gate had not been collected. Her apron hung on its hook beside the door. At first, there was no alarm. Prescott Valley was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Emma often cycled into town to run errands. But when evening came and her bicycle was not in its usual place near the fence, Mr. Grayson began to worry. He drove along the familiar dirt road she always used, the one that curved past the dry fields and led to the main highway. Half a mile out, near a narrow service road, he saw it, Emma's bicycle lying on its side in the dust. The front wheel was bent, the chain loose, the handlebar scuffed. There was no sign of her anywhere. He called the sheriff's department immediately. 2 patrol cars arrived before dark. Flashlights swept across the ground, tracing faint footprints that vanished toward the road. Officers marked the area with tape and collected photographs, noting every detail: the broken chain, the distance from the main track, the absence of tire prints from another vehicle. Back at the guest house, investigators searched Emma's small room. It was neat, almost untouched. The bed was made, a folded uniform lay across the chair, and her sketchbook sat open on the nightstand. The picture inside was unfinished, the outline of a garden she had started drawing days earlier. Her wallet, a few dollars, and her ID rested beside it. Everything looked calm. Too calm. Then one of the officers noticed something on the floor near the bed, a faint glimmer under the lamp's light. He bent down and picked it up carefully. It was a single gold earring. Mrs. Grayson recognized it immediately. Emma never removed those earrings. They were a gift from her younger sister. The discovery did not make sense. Why would she leave one behind? The earring was sealed as evidence. The rest of her belongings were catalogued, but there was nothing else unusual. No note, no struggle, no clear sign of where she had gone or why. It felt as if she had stepped out for a moment and vanished into thin air. Outside, the desert had turned dark. The wind swept through the brush as officers spread out in a line, flashlights cutting across the open fields. The dogs followed her scent from the porch to the road, and then stopped, as if the trail had been swallowed by the night. By midnight, the searchlights dimmed. The Graysons stood on the porch, wrapped in silence, watching the officers load the bicycle into a patrol truck. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only the distant hiss of the wind. Inside the small guest house, the kettle still sat on the stove. The water had long boiled away, leaving a thin ring on the metal surface. The air was heavy, untouched since morning, as though time itself had paused. No one could yet see what that single gold earring meant, or how far its shadow would reach. But one day, decades later, it would speak again, and lead detectives straight to the man who had left it behind. Emma Larkins was 32 when she vanished. She lived a quiet life built around simple habits and steady work. Born and raised in Flagstaff, she had moved to Prescott Valley a few years earlier, taking a live-in maid position for a retired couple, the Graysons. It was stable, predictable, and safe, exactly what she wanted. Those who knew her described her as calm, disciplined, and kind. She was not the type to talk much, but when she did, she spoke softly and always smiled before she answered. Her life had no luxury, but it had structure. Mornings of cleaning, afternoons of errands, and quiet evenings sketching at her small wooden desk by the window. Every month, she sent a portion of her pay to her younger sister, who still lived in Flagstaff. The money was never late, not even once. It was not much, but for Emma, keeping that routine mattered. It was her way of staying connected to home, to family, to something that felt like purpose. Emma's room in the guest house reflected who she was: neat, practical, and modest. A single bed, a folded blanket at the end, and a dresser with a few essentials. Above it hung one small photograph of her and her sister, taken on a county fair day. The corners of the picture had begun to curl, but she kept it in perfect condition. When she was not working, Emma liked to cycle into town. She owned an old blue bicycle, slightly rusted at the edges but still dependable. She often rode to the general store for supplies or stopped by the post office to mail letters. Sometimes she lingered by the art shop window, watching other people's sketches pinned up for display. She rarely socialized, but she was polite to everyone, store clerks, neighbors, even the children who waved when she passed by on her bicycle. Her quiet nature made her well-liked in town, though few people really knew her beyond those brief exchanges. Her employer, Mrs. Grayson, once told investigators that Emma seemed content but distant. She worked hard, never complained, never asked for more than she was given. She preferred silence to small talk and solitude to company. There was something almost fragile about her calmness, as though she lived carefully, afraid to disturb the world around her. But she was not weak. People often mistook her gentleness for that. Emma managed everything alone, her finances, her family support, her work schedule. She repaired her own clothes, fixed the squeaky hinges on the door, and helped with household chores that were not even part of her job. She took pride in being reliable, invisible, and strong in quiet ways. Her one indulgence was art. After finishing her chores, she often sat by the window with a pencil and small sketchbook. She drew simple things, flowers from the garden, faces from memory, outlines of the desert horizon. Her sketches were delicate, unfinished, as if she never quite allowed herself to complete them. To the Graysons, she was more than just an employee. She was part of their daily rhythm. Mrs. Grayson said she could tell the time by the sound of Emma's footsteps moving down the hall each morning. That is why her sudden absence felt so unnatural. When detectives began piecing together her background, they found nothing that explained her disappearance. No financial trouble, no secret relationships, no indication she wanted to leave. Every record described a woman grounded in routine. Nothing about her life pointed toward danger. Then came a detail that changed the tone of the investigation. While reviewing her past conversations, detectives spoke with another housekeeper who occasionally helped at the Graysons' home. The woman remembered something Emma said just a few days before she vanished. It was quiet, almost whispered, said while folding sheets in the laundry room. Emma had told her, "I think someone is following me." At the time, the coworker laughed it off, assuming Emma had misread a stranger's glance or imagined a sound in the dark. But now, in the shadow of her disappearance, those 6 words felt heavy. Investigators wrote them down carefully, knowing they might be the first real glimpse into what Emma had sensed before that spring morning, a warning no one had taken seriously. And as the file on Emma Larkins grew thicker, one question began to rise above all others. Who had been watching her? At 8:15 a.m. on April 17, 1983, Emma Larkins left the guest house with her bicycle and a short list of cleaning supplies written neatly on a folded slip of paper. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of morning that made everything seem ordinary. She wore her work uniform, a pale blue dress with a white collar and matching shoes. The Graysons watched her ride off through the gate, her figure shrinking against the open stretch of desert road that led toward town. She pedaled along the dirt path she used every week, the one lined with wild shrubs and dry mesquite trees. The trip to the general store usually took 15 minutes. She would buy soap, polish, and sometimes a small treat, a chocolate bar or a pencil for her sketching. That morning, she carried only her purse and a canvas bag hanging from the handlebars. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. At approximately 8:35 a.m., a clerk at the Prescott Valley General Store remembered seeing her outside the entrance. She had parked her bicycle near the wall, walked in quietly, and purchased 3 items: floor cleaner, gloves, and a small pack of tea. The receipt showed her transaction ended at 8:42 a.m. What happened next was pieced together from fragments of memory, bits of witness, accounts collected over the following days. A gas station attendant across the street recalled seeing Emma talking to a man beside a beige pickup truck. The conversation seemed brief. The man was described as white, middle-aged, wearing a cap and denim shirt. The attendant said he thought they knew each other because Emma appeared calm. After a minute or two, she handed her bicycle to the man, who leaned it against his truck while they spoke. Then she got back on and rode away in the direction of the old service road. No one saw her again. By noon, the sun burned high over Prescott Valley. The Graysons assumed she had stayed in town longer than usual, perhaps waiting for a delivery. But by late afternoon, the uneaten lunch on the counter and the unopened mail began to raise concern. Mrs. Grayson checked her room. The bed was made, her bag still there, and the sealed pay envelope from the previous week untouched. At 5:30 p.m., Mr. Grayson decided to drive into town to look for her. He followed her usual route, scanning the side of the road for any sign of the blue bicycle. The desert stretched wide and silent, broken only by the faint shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt. Near a bend leading to the service road, something caught his eye. It was her bicycle, lying awkwardly on its side in the dust. The front wheel was bent, the chain slack, one handlebar twisted inward as if it had fallen hard. The canvas bag was still looped over the handle. Inside were her cleaning supplies and the unopened pack of tea. He called the sheriff's office immediately. By the time deputies arrived, the light was beginning to fade. They photographed the bicycle, marked tire impressions, and took note of every small disturbance in the sand. The footprints nearby told a faint story. One set belonging to Emma, smaller, light. Another set, larger, leading toward the service road, before disappearing into rough terrain. The officers noticed something else, faint drag marks in the dirt, just a few yards from the bicycle. They were uneven, like something or someone had been pulled across the ground. The trail ended abruptly near the brush, where the sand hardened and the prints vanished. Search teams spread out across the area, calling her name as darkness began to settle. Flashlights swept through the dry fields, illuminating bits of stone, broken bottles, and wind-blown weeds. Dogs were brought in, following her scent for several hundred yards before losing it near the edge of a shallow ravine. Through the night, volunteers combed the roadside. Nothing else was found. No purse, no shoes, no sign of struggle beyond those faint marks in the sand. It was as if the desert had swallowed her whole. The following morning, Sheriff Alan Kemp ordered a wider search perimeter. Helicopters scanned the terrain, while deputies on foot examined each dry creek bed and wash area. Reporters began to gather near the main road, asking questions that no one could answer. For 2 days, the only evidence remained the abandoned bicycle, the footprints, and silence. Then, on the third morning, a local farmer named Clyde Patterson was walking his dog near a dry wash about 11 miles outside town. The area was rugged, scattered with thorny brush and broken stone. His dog began barking and tugging toward the edge of a shallow ditch. When Patterson stepped closer, he saw a small piece of fabric tangled around a branch. It was faded blue, frayed at the edges and stained with dust. He pulled it free and realized it was a torn section of a uniform, the same color as the one Emma Larkins had been wearing when she left the guest house. He carried it straight to the sheriff's office. Investigators examined the cloth under bright lights, confirming the match. The fabric had a faint scent of detergent, the same kind found in the Graysons' home. It was the first physical trace of Emma since her disappearance. The desert had been silent for days, but now it had given something back. A small, torn reminder that the story of Emma Larkins was far from over. 2 days after the torn fabric was found, the desert revealed the rest. The search teams began at dawn, moving in slow lines through the harsh terrain 11 miles east of Prescott Valley. The air was dry, the heat already building as the sun climbed higher. Volunteers, deputies, and forensic officers fanned out across the brush-covered land. It was quiet except for the steady hum of radios and the crunch of boots over the sand. At 9:47 a.m., one of the searchers called out. He had noticed something pale beneath a patch of sunburned brush near a dry ridge. Officers approached carefully, clearing the area branch by branch. Within minutes they saw it, a section of fabric pressed against the soil, half covered by dust and weeds. It matched the same light blue color as the torn piece found by the farmer days earlier. They continued to clear the area until the outline of a body became visible beneath the sand. The remains were partially buried, hidden just deep enough to be missed by passing eyes. The discovery brought the search to an abrupt halt. The ground was marked and photographed before any movement. The scene was methodical, quiet, and precise. Crime scene technicians stepped carefully, documenting every angle of the surroundings. The sparse vegetation, the scattered stones, and the faint indentation of tire marks a few yards away. A small perimeter was established to protect what the desert had kept. The remains were confirmed to be female. Her uniform was torn at the sleeves, one shoe missing, and a thin gold chain still around her neck. In her right hand, the sand had hardened around a clump of fabric, as if she had tried to hold on. The stillness of that image stayed with everyone present. By early afternoon, the coroner's van arrived. Investigators sifted the area inch by inch, collecting small traces. Fragments of clothing, a button, and a cigarette butt lying near a patch of disturbed ground. The butt was sealed in a separate bag. One detective noted that Emma Larkins did not smoke. Whoever had been there last had. Tire impressions were photographed next. The tread was unusual, deep, cross-patterned, suggesting a heavy vehicle or pickup. Technicians made plaster casts before the wind could erase them. Beside the tire marks were faint boot prints, mostly broken by the soil, but still visible under the slant of the afternoon light. As the body was lifted, investigators saw the position of her arms, drawn upward slightly, consistent with restraint. Her hair was matted with sand, and her skin bore faint discoloration around the neck. The medical examiner present at the scene spoke in low tones. There were no gunshot wounds, no sharp injuries. The cause, he said quietly, appeared to be strangulation. By 4 p.m., the body was transported to the county medical facility for examination. The crime scene was left marked and sealed until every sample had been catalogued. The photographs showed the harshness of the setting, the cracked earth, the thin line of brush, and the vast emptiness stretching around it. It was isolation made visible. That evening, the sheriff's office confirmed to the press that human remains had been found. No names were released, but inside the station, the investigators already knew. The blue fabric, the uniform buttons, the necklace, all matched the missing woman from Prescott Valley. At the morgue, the autopsy began under the cool hum of fluorescent lights. The examination was clinical and restrained. Time of death was estimated to be within hours of her disappearance. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she was overpowered quickly. Traces of desert soil were found in her airway, confirming she had been outdoors when she died. The cause of death was listed formally as homicide by manual strangulation. Detective Mark Hollins, who had led the search, reviewed the evidence that night with his partner, Sandra Ruiz. The list was short but vital. Torn blue uniform, partial. Fingerprints on the fabric. Tire impressions from a heavy vehicle. Single cigarette butt. One missing shoe still unaccounted. For the partial prints were sent to the state lab for analysis, though forensic technology in 1983 could not identify them with certainty. The cigarette was sealed and stored for possible future testing in case new methods ever emerged. Back at the scene, technicians continued working under portable lights until midnight. They mapped the tire tracks again, measuring the depth and distance between impressions. The markings indicated a pickup truck with worn rear tires, the tread design uncommon, almost industrial. A database of local vehicle registrations showed only a handful of owners using that make in the surrounding county. It was a small detail, but in cases like this, small details mattered. As the team packed their equipment, the desert grew silent again. The wind moved through the brush, erasing the last traces of footprints. Yet beneath that silence, something solid remained. The pattern of those tires pressed into the earth, recorded forever in plaster and photographs. Later, in the sheriff's office, Detective Hollins placed the print casts side by side on his desk. He studied the cross-pattern grooves, the slight wear on one edge. He knew these shapes might one day lead to the person who had taken Emma's life. The case file now carried a single line under evidence summary: tire tread pattern, rare make, limited circulation in Yavapai County, and with that, the investigation narrowed. Somewhere in the quiet sprawl of Arizona, A beige pickup truck carried the same pattern under its wheels, the silent imprint of a killer's path across the desert. The first week after Emma Larkins's body was found turned the quiet town of Prescott Valley into a place of unease. Every street corner, every dusty parking lot seemed to carry the weight of her name. For detectives Mark Hollins and Sandra Ruiz, the pressure was immediate. The town wanted answers. The evidence, however, was thin. Their first task was to trace everyone who had known Emma, anyone who had spoken to her, worked with her, or crossed paths in those final days. The process began with interviews, slow and methodical. They visited the Graysons' home again, the small room where Emma had lived still untouched. Her belongings remained neatly folded, as if she would return any moment. Hollins noticed the single sketchbook on her desk. On the final page, she had drawn the outline of a desert road. 3 names soon stood out in the early investigation: Tom Avery, Robert Bobby Miles, and Paul Granger. Tom Avery was the first. A maintenance worker in town, 34 years old, with no criminal history. He had dated Emma briefly the previous year, a quiet relationship that ended without public incident. The Graysons said Emma had mentioned him only once afterward, describing him as kind, but temperamental. Hollins and Ruiz found him working at a repair shop when they arrived. Tom agreed to speak, though his body language told a different story. He kept rubbing his hands together, glancing at the tape recorder as the questions began. He said he had not spoken to Emma in over 6 months. The relationship, according to him, just faded. On the morning she disappeared, he claimed to have been at work repairing a generator at the water treatment plant. The foreman confirmed his presence, but the hours were loosely recorded. When asked if he knew what kind of car he drove, he mentioned an old sedan, not a truck. Detectives noted it, but the tension in his voice lingered after he left. The second name came from local records: Robert Bobby Miles, a drifter known to spend nights near the outskirts of town. He had prior arrests for assault and petty theft, but no stable address. Several townspeople claimed to have seen him near the service road the week Emma disappeared. Hollins and Ruiz found him sleeping behind an abandoned shed near the rail tracks. The interview was conducted outdoors, in the dry wind. Bobby denied any involvement. His tone was defensive, almost angry. He said he had heard about the woman, but had nothing to do with her. When asked if he knew Emma personally, he paused before answering. He said he had seen her once riding her bicycle near the store, but had never spoken to her. He carried no clear alibi for the morning of April 12th. He said he had been moving through town, collecting bottles for recycling money. His fingerprints were taken for comparison with the partial ones recovered from the uniform fabric, but 1983 technology offered little resolution. The results were inconclusive. The prints were too faint, too partial to confirm or exclude anyone. The third name, Paul Granger, came as a surprise. He was a married store clerk, well-liked and known for his polite manner. Witnesses mentioned that he often chatted with Emma when she came in to buy cleaning supplies. Mrs. Grayson recalled once teasing Emma about the attention, and Emma had responded only with a quiet smile. When questioned, Granger was calm. He said Emma came to his store regularly, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. He described her as a nice girl, quiet, always respectful. On the day she vanished, he claimed she had visited around 8:30 a.m. to buy disinfectant and cloths. He remembered her clearly because she spoke briefly to a man in a beige pickup truck outside the store. That statement caught Hollins's attention. The mention of the beige truck matched earlier witness reports. Granger said he had seen the driver leaning out the window, talking to Emma for less than a minute. When asked if he recognized the man, he said no, only that he was light-haired, wearing a cap. Investigators checked local vehicle registrations again. The rare tire tread found at the crime scene still had only a few possible matches in the county. They began visiting each owner one by one, photographing vehicles, comparing treads, and eliminating suspects. Nothing matched perfectly. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading through Prescott Valley. Some said Emma had been planning to leave town. Others whispered about a secret relationship. None of it could be verified, but the gossip made the case harder to control. Hollins and Ruiz worked long hours trying to separate fact from fiction. The forensic limitations of the time weighed on them. The partial fingerprints could not be run through a national database. There was none. The cigarette butt found at the scene was sealed and stored, but without modern DNA testing, it could not reveal its owner. Tire analysis was manual, dependent on visual comparison and local manufacturer records. Each clue was a fragment, and none could form a full picture. The detectives returned to the timeline. They reconstructed Emma's movements minute by minute. At 8:15 a.m., she left the guest house on her bicycle. By 8:30, she was seen outside the general store. By 9 she was gone. The beige pickup was now their central focus. They questioned mechanics, delivery drivers, and ranchers. Several owned beige or light-colored trucks, but all were accounted for. Still, Hollins believed the driver was local. Prescott Valley was too small for strangers to pass unnoticed. Sandra Ruiz began rechecking old police records, focusing on anyone who had ever been accused of following or harassing women in the area. She found a few minor cases, none recent. The investigation was widening, but progress was slow. One evening, as the detectives reviewed their notes under the low hum of the station lights, the phone rang. Hollins answered. The voice on the other end was male, deep but strained, distorted slightly as if the caller was using a cloth to cover the receiver. He said only one sentence. You should ask about the man she argued with near the old water tower. Before Hollins could respond, the line went dead. The time of the call was logged, 9:12 p.m. The number was untraceable. But the statement gave them a new lead, one that reopened the final hours before Emma's disappearance. The next morning, the detectives drove toward the edge of town where the old water tower still stood against the pale sky. The place was isolated, surrounded by scrub and sand. Whatever happened there might hold the key to what Emma had seen and who she had been trying to escape. News of Emma Larkins's death spread through Prescott Valley slowly at first, then all at once. For a town accustomed to quiet mornings and unlocked doors, the discovery was more than tragedy. It was disruption. The streets that once felt safe now seemed watchful. People spoke in lowered tones, glancing over their shoulders as they talked. Within days, a small vigil formed outside the general store where she was last seen. Candles were placed in a loose circle around her photograph. A grainy image taken years earlier, showing her half smiling at the camera. A few neighbors stood silently, heads bowed, the wax melting into the dry dust at their feet. No speeches were made. In Prescott Valley, people mourned in silence. Local newspapers covered the case cautiously. The Prescott Herald printed a 2-column report beneath the headline, Local Woman Found Dead, Investigation Underway. The article included no speculation, only verified facts. But in town, speculation was everywhere. Parents began escorting their children to school. Women who once walked alone to the post office started moving in pairs. Locks sold out at the hardware store by the end of the week. In a community where most people had known one another for decades, suspicion crept in quietly and stayed. Sheriff Alan Kemp held a short press briefing outside the station. He confirmed that the investigation was ongoing and urged residents to remain calm. His words were measured, his tone firm, but the fear did not fade. Too much had already changed. 3 days after the announcement, a bus from Flagstaff arrived carrying a single passenger, Emma's younger sister, Leah Larkins. She was 28, a schoolteacher, and had not seen Emma in nearly 6 months. Detectives met her at the terminal. In the interview room, Leah sat across from Detectives Hollins and Ruiz, answering questions with quiet precision. She confirmed that Emma had mailed her money each month and had last written a letter 2 weeks before her death. In that letter, Emma had sounded tired but hopeful, mentioning only that work was steady and the desert was beginning to warm again. When asked if her sister had ever expressed fear, Leah hesitated. Then she recalled a brief phone call a few days before the disappearance. Emma had mentioned someone making her uneasy, though she did not name who it was. Leah had assumed it was a misunderstanding, an unwanted advance perhaps, or a local drunk bothering her in town. She now wished she had asked more. After the interview, Leah visited the guest house one last time. She stood in her sister's small room, looking at the neat bed, the folded clothes, the sketchbook left open on the desk. She closed it gently before leaving. In town, people continued their routines, though slower, more deliberate. The desert still looked the same, wide and bright, but it no longer felt open. Windows stayed closed even during the heat. The sound of passing trucks on the highway made people turn their heads. The case had become the center of every conversation, even as new leads stalled. Detectives Hollins and Ruiz worked late, cataloging every piece of evidence, each item bagged and stored in the evidence locker. One of those items was the cigarette butt recovered from the crime scene. For weeks, it had been considered insignificant, but a recent lab note changed that. The cigarette carried traces of saliva. In another decade, it might have been enough to name a suspect. In 1983, it was only another mystery sealed inside a plastic bag, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. Summer settled over Prescott Valley like a heavy silence. The search for Emma Larkins had stretched into months, and each new lead began to feel more fragile than the one before. What had once been an urgent investigation was slowly becoming a list of possibilities that led nowhere. Detectives Mark Hollins and Sandra Ruiz worked through them methodically. Every few days, a new name surfaced. A new rumor whispered through the narrow streets of town. Some claimed Emma had been seen arguing near the highway days before her death. Others said she had been planning to leave Prescott Valley altogether. None of it matched the facts. The first major lead came in late May. A drifter was arrested in Chaitadilla, a nearby county, after boasting in a bar that he knew what happened to that woman in the desert. The statement spread quickly, and within hours Hollins and Ruiz were driving out to question him. The man was thin, unshaven, and clearly intoxicated. In the interview room, he repeated fragments of what he had said earlier, that he had been there, that it was over fast. But when pressed for details, his story collapsed. He could not name the location, describe Emma, or recall the color of her bicycle. The confession was discarded by the end of the day. He was released with no charges. The disappointment was quiet, but heavy. Ruiz noted in her report, subject unreliable, likely seeking attention. It was the first of several false confessions that year. By June, investigators received another lead. A beige pickup truck matching the witness description had been spotted on the outskirts of town. It belonged to a local mechanic named Ray Danner. His vehicle seemed promising at first glance. Similar color, same model year, even the same make of tires as those noted in Emma's case file. Hollins ordered a full forensic comparison. Tire impressions from the desert were measured against Danner's treads under bright forensic lights. The match failed. His tire size was 2 inches wider than the ones found at the scene. Danner was cleared. Still, the hope that this could have been the truck made the disappointment sharper. Ruiz later wrote, "Each false lead takes time. Each hour away from truth makes the silence deeper." As weeks passed, the investigation grew quieter. The sheriff's department had other cases, other calls. Without new evidence, Emma's file began to move down the priority list. Forensic limitations made every step harder. The partial fingerprints remained too faint for comparison. The cigarette butt, sealed carefully in evidence, was analyzed again. But the only result confirmed what they already knew: saliva present, no way to identify. Even the rare tire tread pattern, once their strongest clue, began to fade in importance. Regional searches for similar vehicles produced nothing definitive. Records were incomplete, and some owners had already sold or scrapped their trucks. The beige pickup that had seemed so close to being found now existed only in memory. Through it all, the town slowly adjusted. The headlines disappeared. New events filled the paper: local fairs, weather reports, county elections. Life returned to its routine rhythm. People no longer spoke Emma's name aloud, but the undercurrent of unease remained. Some still kept their doors locked at night, a habit that would outlast the investigation itself. By early autumn, Hollins and Ruiz prepared their final report for the year. It summarized every interview, every item of evidence, every unanswered question. The pages were thick with handwritten notes and red markings, a record of months of effort that had led nowhere certain. When the time came to archive the case, Ruiz placed the folder on the evidence shelf beside a row of other cold files. She lingered for a moment, reading the name on the spine. Larkins, Ema, 1983, homicide. Then she turned off the light and walked out. But Hollins did not leave it behind. He made a personal copy of the case summary, photocopied pages, photos, and the final scene sketches, and kept them in a brown envelope locked in his desk drawer. He said it was only for reference, but Ruiz knew better. Late one evening, as the two detectives prepared to go home, she noticed him still at his desk, the envelope open before him. The edges of the papers had begun to curl, the ink fading slightly under the lamp. She asked quietly, "You are not letting this one go, are you?" Hollins closed the folder, his gaze steady but distant. "No," he said. "This one is not over." Outside, the desert night was still and dark. The wind moved faintly through the brush, carrying with it the lingering weight of a name that had not yet found justice. Ema Larkins. Time moved forward, steady and indifferent. The summer heat of 1983 turned to autumn, then winter, and with it, the urgency surrounding Ema Larkins's murder began to fade. New cases arrived, burglaries, accidents, domestic calls, each one slowly pushing her file further down the stack. By 1985, the headlines had stopped. The local paper no longer mentioned her name. The beige pickup, once a town-wide obsession, became a fading rumor. The sketches, the photographs, the maps marked with red circles all found their way into a single box labeled Larkins, 1983. It was sealed, catalogued and placed on a metal shelf in the evidence storage room. Row 3, Section D, Prescott Valley grew quieter in the years that followed. The empty lots where search teams once gathered were developed into houses. The old service road was repaved, its edges trimmed and lined with new fencing. The desert brush that had once hidden her body grew back thick and unbothered, covering the ground as if nothing had ever happened there. Ema's family eventually left Arizona. Her sister Leah moved to New Mexico for work, later marrying and changing her last name. She never returned to Prescott Valley, but she kept one framed photo of Ema on her desk, the same picture used in the newspaper article decades earlier. For the sheriff's department, the case became one among hundreds of cold files. The limitations of the 1980s had made it nearly impossible to solve. No usable fingerprints, no witnesses, no suspect vehicles, just a cigarette butt sealed in plastic and a tire tread that led nowhere. Detective Mark Hollins retired in 1995, his memory of the case still sharp but buried under years of other investigations. Sandra Ruiz stayed on a little longer. She was patient, meticulous, and unshaken by time, but even she had to admit defeat. When she finally retired in 2002, she took nothing from the office except a few notebooks and a habit, a quiet ritual she kept every year, each April. On the anniversary of Ema's disappearance, Ruiz would visit the department archives. She would sign her name in the visitor's log, retrieve the box marked Larkins, 1983, and sit at the same table where she once reviewed it with Hollins. The files were old now, yellowed pages, photographs fading at the edges. She would read through them slowly, noting the careful handwriting, the typed witness statements, the grainy images of desert sand. It was not hope that brought her back, not entirely. It was duty, a quiet promise that someone would still remember. The years continued to turn. The world changed around her. The tools of investigation evolved, computers, digital records, national DNA systems. Cases once thought impossible began to find answers through new science. Ruiz watched the reports on television, hearing about old crimes solved by traces of blood or hair decades later. She wondered if Ema's cigarette butt still sat untouched in its evidence bag. By 2010, Prescott Valley had grown into a larger town. The streets were wider, the population doubled, and the desert around it felt smaller. But for those who had lived through that year, 1983, the memory of the missing maid still lingered quietly beneath everything new. In the spring of 2016, an announcement came from the State Forensic Division. A new initiative would reopen unsolved homicide cases using advanced DNA testing. The program aimed to re-examine old evidence collected before the mid-1990s. Among the list of cases selected for review was one that had not been touched in over 30 years. Emma Larkins, Prescott Valley, 1983. The file that had sat silent for decades was about to be opened once again. In March 2016, inside a sterile laboratory at the Arizona Department of Public Safety, a technician opened a sealed evidence box labeled Larkins. Emma, 1983. The tape was brittle with age. The handwriting faded but still legible. Inside were items preserved for over 3 decades, fragments of fabric, sealed soil samples, and one small plastic tube containing a cigarette butt wrapped in protective gauze. It was the same cigarette recovered from the sand 11 miles outside Prescott Valley. The one that had carried saliva, but no means of identification. In 1983, it was nothing more than a trace of possibility. In 2016, it was potential proof. The laboratory was part of a new state initiative, a forensic effort designed to re-examine cold cases using advanced DNA sequencing and national database comparison. Old evidence was being brought back to life across Arizona. The Larkins file had been selected because of the preserved biological trace. Technician Aaron Malloy logged the sample, entered the case code, and began the reprocessing protocol. She cut a small section from the filter, placed it into a sterile vial, and began the chemical extraction. Each step was documented carefully: the temperature, reagent batch number, and timing. The air smelled faintly of alcohol and latex. DNA isolation had improved beyond recognition since the early days of forensic testing. Where once a full sample was required, now even degraded traces could yield genetic information. After hours of careful preparation, the extracted DNA was placed into the sequencer, a sleek machine glowing under dim blue light. The process was automated, silent except for the steady hum of the machine. It analyzed, amplified, and digitized. Within hours, strands of genetic code began appearing as data on the monitor, sequences that would have been unreadable in the 1980s, now forming clear digital signatures. Malloy uploaded the completed profile into CODIS, the combined DNA index system, where millions of criminal records from across the country were stored. She entered the case number and waited. The software began its cross-comparison. Millions of lines of code aligning, scanning, testing. Minutes passed in stillness. Then on the screen a small window flashed red. Match found. 1 entry. The technician leaned closer. The name displayed beneath the code sequence read, Paul Granger. It was a name once buried in the old reports. The store clerk from Prescott Valley. Interviewed and released in 1983. He had been 32 at the time, married, polite, and cooperative. The report described him as not a person of concern, but now his DNA was an exact match to the cigarette found beside Emma Larkins's body. Malloy immediately contacted her supervisor. The lab confirmed the result twice, using independent sequencing. There was no doubt. The saliva on that cigarette belonged to Paul Granger. By the next morning, the cold case unit was notified. An email was sent to retired Detective Sandra Ruiz, who had once signed her name on every page of that case file. She was sitting at her kitchen table when she received the call. The voice on the other end said only, "Detective Ruiz, we have a match on the Larkins case." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she asked quietly, "Who?" The answer brought 33 years of silence crashing into motion. A new task force was formed within days, led by Detective Carla Jensen, one of the state's cold case specialists. She studied the old photographs, the faded reports, and the familiar name that had resurfaced after decades. The first step was verification. They confirmed Granger's current location, a residential address in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He had lived there for over 15 years, working intermittently in retail jobs. His record showed no major offenses, no arrests since the 1980s. He had married twice, divorced twice, and lived alone. Investigators retrieved employment records, tax filings, and driver's license renewals. Everything appeared ordinary, yet the DNA match was absolute. Detective Jensen met with Ruiz in person. Ruiz, now gray-haired but sharp-eyed, sat with the file open in front of her once more. She ran her finger over the old report, her own notes beside Granger's name, married, cooperative, seen speaking with victim. Claimed no contact outside store. She closed the folder. "He was right there," she said quietly. All along, the reactivated case drew quiet attention within the department. Reporters were not informed yet, and the official notice remained sealed under the cold case program. But within the team, the energy was unmistakable, a mix of disbelief and determination. They reconstructed the timeline again. April 17th, 1983. Emma leaves the guest house. Seen at 8:30 a.m. at the general store. Paul Granger, the clerk, was there. He later claimed she spoke to a man in a beige truck. No one ever verified that man existed. The cigarette had been found near her body. He had smoked it. The implication was direct and damning. By mid-April 2016, warrants were being drafted for surveillance and background inquiry. The district attorney's office was notified discreetly. They wanted confirmation before making contact. While reviewing Granger's recent records, the investigative analyst discovered something that made everyone pause. 2 weeks earlier, Paul Granger had submitted an online job application for a warehouse supervisor position in Albuquerque. The position required a mandatory background check, including fingerprint and identity verification. He had no idea that the system he was about to enter would cross paths with the one that had just found him. Unaware, Paul Granger went about his days, the man who had once watched Emma Larkins buy cleaning supplies under the desert sun, never knowing that the past he buried was preparing to return with his own name on it. Detective Rachel Mendel began reviewing the Emma Larkins file 3 days after the DNA match confirmation. The folder was heavy, not in size but in history. More than 30 years of silence, unanswered questions, and one name now standing out in bold: Paul Granger. Mendel was known inside the Arizona cold case unit for her precision. She treated old files like living puzzles, each detail capable of changing meaning with time. When she took the Larkins case, she started where every detective begins. At the beginning, she read every interview transcript, every field report, and every photograph. Then she noticed something small: handwritten notes on the margins of an early report, written by a former investigator named Sandra Ruiz. Those notes were not part of the official digital archive. Rachel contacted Ruiz the next morning. The retired detective still lived in Flagstaff. When Rachel arrived, Sandra was already waiting on her porch, a cardboard box beside her chair. She smiled faintly when Rachel introduced herself. "I thought this call might come someday," Sandra said. "The truth never stays buried forever." Inside the box were her personal notes from 1983, pages she had kept when the department moved to a new filing system. They were neatly arranged, labeled in fading ink. One envelope was marked, Granger, Paul, Supplemental. Rachel read through the papers carefully. Sandra had written that Paul Granger's statement contained timing inconsistencies. He had claimed he was at the store until 9 a.m., but another employee recalled he left earlier, around 8:45. That window, 15 minutes, overlapped perfectly with the time Emma disappeared. At the time, no physical evidence linked him to the scene, and the cigarette had been useless without DNA. But now, every detail mattered again. Rachel thanked Sandra and promised to update her. Before leaving, Sandra said quietly, "Be patient. This case punishes those who rush it." Back in Phoenix, Rachel reopened the investigation officially. She began tracing Paul Granger's life from the moment he left Prescott Valley. After 1985, his records became scattered, short jobs, frequent moves. He relocated to New Mexico in the early 1990s, working mostly in retail and repair. His most recent address matched the one already under quiet surveillance. Rachel drove there herself. The neighborhood in Albuquerque was ordinary. Small, sun-faded homes, chain-link fences, and dust gathering in the gutters. She parked across the street and watched for a while. Paul Granger was older now, mid-60s, gray hair, slight limp. He moved carefully, almost invisibly. She took note of his car, a dented sedan, and the small habits that stood out: smoking on the porch every evening, leaving briefly after midnight once or twice a week. Nothing about him seemed urgent or dangerous, but his calmness unsettled her. Rachel cross-referenced his employment history and found discrepancies. Payroll logs from a 1983 inventory job in Prescott Valley did not match his own statement to police. He had said he worked that entire week, but the company records showed he clocked out 2 days before Emma vanished. That lie had been buried for decades. When she confronted the archives clerk about the payroll slips, the woman said quietly, if anyone had checked those back then, they would have seen it. Each piece of the puzzle was aligning in a pattern that no longer looked coincidental. Rachel returned to the evidence board late that night. Under the photograph of Emma Larkins, she pinned a new note, Granger, timeline falsified. Then another. Vehicle records missing. She remembered from Sandra's notes that witnesses had described a beige pickup truck near the general store, the same one seen when Emma was last alive. Granger's wife at the time had denied owning any vehicle matching that description. No registration had ever surfaced. Rachel requested an updated vehicle history search under Granger's old name and alternate addresses. After days of digging through DMV archives, she found a partial record from 1983, a private sale of an unregistered beige Ford pickup, buyer listed as Paul G. The transaction was never finalized. That loose end sent her to Albuquerque once more. Local authorities assisted quietly. They checked garages, yards, and rental properties once belonging to Granger. Most were empty or demolished, but one record stood out, a rented storage unit on the outskirts of the city, listed under a secondary name he had used for a short time in the 1990s. The unit was still active. Paid through an automatic account deduction, Detective Mendel obtained a search warrant. The night before the entry, she sat in her car outside the facility, reviewing the original crime scene photos. The faint drag marks, the tire impressions, the fragment of fabric. She imagined Emma's last moments, the silence of that desert morning. It was not emotion that drove her. It was precision. There was a truth buried in that storage unit, and she intended to find it. When the team unlocked the door the next morning, the air inside was stale. Dust coated everything, old tools, boxes, and rusted furniture. Rachel moved slowly, scanning for anything metallic or automotive. Near the back wall, half covered with a tarp, she found a box marked Parts. Inside was a collection of old vehicle components, spark plugs, wiring, and one dented hubcap. Its faded paint was unmistakably beige. Forensic technicians bagged it immediately. The embossed pattern on the rim matched a rare design, the same model referenced in the 1983 evidence notes. Rachel compared the markings against the archived tire tread photograph. The alignment was identical. 33 years later, a single piece of metal had survived to tell the truth. As she sealed the evidence bag, Rachel glanced once at the storage unit's dark interior. The dust, the silence, and the forgotten remnants all seemed to echo one certainty. Emma Larkins had never really left this case. She had simply waited to be found again. And now, with that hubcap in her hands, Detective Rachel Mendel knew the next step would no longer be quiet. The interrogation room was quiet when Paul Granger entered. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound as the door clicked shut behind him. He sat across from Detective Rachel Mendel, his hands folded, his face expressionless. The years had not softened him, but they had worn him down. His shoulders curved inward, his eyes dull but watchful, the look of a man who had lived too long with something he could not erase. He said nothing at first. Rachel placed a small folder on the table, thin but heavy with truth. Across its cover was a single name, Emma Larkins. Do you remember her? She asked. Paul's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, then settled again on the table. He gave no answer. Rachel did not press. She opened the folder instead, spreading out the photographs, the desert brush, the bicycle, the fragments of fabric. Then she slid a clear evidence bag toward him. Inside was a worn cigarette butt. This was found beside her body, she said. It carries your DNA. Paul's jaw tightened. Still, he did not speak. Rachel waited. Silence was part of the process. It forced truth to fill the space. After a minute, she continued, her tone even. We also found a beige truck hubcap in your storage unit. It matches the tire tread recovered at the scene. You kept it for decades. Paul looked up. His expression did not show fear, only fatigue. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. His voice was rough, the words deliberate. Rachel leaned forward. You lied in 1983. You told investigators you were at work that morning, but you were not. Records show you left early. Witnesses saw you speaking to Emma near the general store. Then she disappeared. Why? For several seconds, Paul did not answer. His gaze drifted toward the wall clock, ticking steadily. Then, as if surrendering to something inevitable, he exhaled and said, She was standing by the road. I offered her a ride. The room seemed to still. Rachel did not interrupt. She said no at first. Paul continued. Then she changed her mind. I drove her part of the way, just talking. I do not even remember what about. Then she said something. I do not know why it made me angry. Maybe I thought she was mocking me. It happened too fast. His tone was flat, almost detached. It was not a confession of guilt as much as a narration of something mechanical, long rehearsed in his own memory. She tried to get out, he said. I grabbed her arm. I did not mean for it to go that far. I did not plan it. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles pale. It was just a moment of anger that never ended. Rachel let the silence return. It was heavier now, filled with the echo of his words. She asked quietly, What did you do afterward? Paul stared at the floor. I panicked. I drove out past the service road. I thought no one would find her there. I buried her shallow because the ground was hard. He did not cry. He did not defend himself. Every sentence came out as if it had already been accepted. A truth that had lived too long in darkness. Rachel asked one final question. Why did you keep the hubcap? He hesitated, then almost inaudibly said, Because I could not throw everything away. Part of me wanted to remember, even if it ruined me. The recorder clicked softly in the background. The confession was complete. No dramatic outburst, no bargaining. Just the calm delivery of a man who had lived beneath the weight of silence for 33 years. When he finished speaking, Paul folded his hands again and stared at the table. The air in the room felt colder. Rachel ended the session and stepped outside. The hallway was empty except for 2 uniformed officers waiting near the door. She handed them the signed statement and said, Book him. They nodded, moving without a word. As they entered the room, Paul did not resist. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. His wrists trembled slightly as they secured the cuffs. On the way out, he glanced once toward the open folder on the table. Emma's photograph faced upward, a black and white image of a woman whose story had waited decades for this moment. His eyes lingered on it for only a second, then lowered again. Outside the precinct, the air was heavy with desert heat. News of the arrest spread before the official announcement. By evening, local radio stations were repeating the same headline. Prescott Valley cold case solved after 3 decades. Suspect in custody. For many in the small Arizona town, the name Emma Larkins had faded into local legend, a story whispered about, but rarely discussed. Now her case was suddenly alive again. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as police escorted the handcuffed man past them. Residents who had once been children during the 1980s watched the footage with disbelief. In Flagstaff, Emma's sister received the call she had long stopped expecting. She did not speak for several seconds after hearing the words, "We have a confession." The quiet on the line said everything. Back in Prescott Valley, the old guest house where Emma had worked still stood. The owners had passed away, but the building remained unchanged, a silent witness to history. Neighbors left flowers at its gate that evening, some not even knowing why they felt compelled to stop. The next morning, headlines filled the state. Paul Granger admits guilt in 1983 murder of local maid. The simplicity of the confession startled even the most seasoned detectives. No elaborate motive, no hidden agenda, just a moment of rage frozen in time, finally uncovered by science and persistence. In the records of the Arizona Cold Case Unit, the entry for case number 1983-147 changed status from unsolved to closed, yet the closure brought no celebration, only stillness. Detective Rachel Mendel stood by the evidence board one last time. She removed Emma's photograph and placed it carefully into the final case file. Around her, the hum of the station continued. New cases, new files, new mysteries waiting for answers. But for a moment, the noise faded. She looked down at the file in her hands and thought of the decades of silence, the detectives who had come before her, and the woman whose voice had been lost but not forgotten. In the end, truth had surfaced, not with noise, but with quiet resignation, from the lips of a man who could no longer outrun what he had done. And as the sun set over Prescott Valley that evening, the town that had long forgotten Emma Larkins finally remembered her name once more. When Paul Granger was led into the county courthouse in handcuffs, Prescott Valley seemed to pause. For 3 decades, his name had been nothing more than a footnote in an old file, a forgotten detail in a case too cold to touch. Now, it was printed across headlines, repeated in morning broadcasts, and whispered in every corner of the town. People struggled to reconcile the face on their screens with the man they once knew. Some remembered him as the quiet clerk at the general store who bagged groceries and offered small talk about weather. Others recalled that he had simply vanished after 1984, moving away without a word. No one had imagined he was carrying a secret that dark. Local reporters gathered outside the courthouse steps, their microphones catching fragments of disbelief from longtime residents. "He used to fix bikes for kids," one woman said softly. "How could someone like that do something so terrible?" Another added, "It feels like part of the town's innocence is gone." Inside the courtroom, the air was still. The trial had not yet begun, but the first hearing, the formal reading of charges, drew a quiet crowd. At the back of the room, an elderly woman sat alone, her hands clasped in her lap. It was Lydia Larkins, Emma's younger sister. Time had aged her face, but not her composure. She had traveled from Flagstaff the night before, arriving early and refusing interviews. When the bailiff read aloud the charge, first-degree murder in the death of Emma Larkins, committed in 1983, Lydia did not cry. Her eyes stayed fixed on Paul, who stood motionless beside his attorney. He said nothing, not even when asked for acknowledgement. His silence was the same as it had been in the interrogation room, empty, resigned. To those watching, it felt as though he had already accepted what was coming. Detective Rachel Mendel sat a few rows behind Lydia, present not as an investigator but as a witness to resolution. She watched quietly, her mind replaying the months of evidence gathering, the late nights of rechecking files, and the single moment when the DNA hit appeared on her screen. This was what justice looked like after decades, not triumph, but quiet recognition. Outside, television vans filled the courthouse parking lot. News anchors spoke in practiced tones. After 33 years, the Emma Larkins case finally reaches court. Each report repeated the same chilling detail, that Paul Granger had confessed to killing her after an argument and burying her body in the desert. Residents from the 1980s called in to share memories of Emma. Some had gone to the same church as the retired couple she worked for. Others remembered seeing her bicycle outside the general store on weekends. It was as if an entire generation was remembering her all at once, a woman whose story had been frozen in time. For Lydia, the hearing did not bring relief. Closure was not a word she used. When a reporter asked how she felt, she answered only, "I have been waiting half my life for this day. It feels quiet, too quiet." That quiet hung over Prescott Valley in the days that followed. Candlelight vigils appeared again near the old guest house, much smaller than before, but no less sincere. Younger residents, who had only heard fragments of the story from their parents, attended to honor someone they had never met. Paul Granger was transferred to a state facility pending trial. He remained under constant observation, showing no visible emotion or regret. Psychological evaluations described him as detached, cooperative, and fully aware of his actions. The prosecution prepared its case, though the confession and forensic evidence already left little doubt. Detective Mendel closed her final report 2 weeks later. The Larkins file was marked resolved and moved to the State Archive. She placed a single note at the end. Truth delayed is still truth delivered. Yet just as the case seemed to settle into history, a new detail surfaced. During background reviews for the upcoming trial, reporters began searching deeper into Paul Granger's past. Old police records from nearby towns in the 1980s revealed something unsettling. 2 other women had gone missing during the years he lived there. Both cases remained unsolved. Both involved victims last seen near stores or service roads, and both investigations had briefly listed Paul Granger as a person of interest before clearing him due to lack of evidence. The discovery spread quickly. Headlines shifted again. Emma Larkin's killer linked to 2 other disappearances. Whispers of doubt and dread returned to Prescott Valley. What if Emma's murder had not been an isolated tragedy but part of a pattern hidden by time and distance? As the sun dipped behind the desert hills that evening, the courthouse lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty steps. The town had waited 33 years for answers, but it seemed the story of Paul Granger and the darkness he carried was not finished yet. The case of Emma Larkins did not end with noise. It ended with silence. The same silence that had surrounded her for 33 years. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the final reports were filed, what remained was not triumph, but truth. A truth uncovered by persistence, by science, and by time itself. In the end, it was not a witness or a confession that gave Emma her voice back. It was technology, a fragment of DNA sealed inside a small evidence envelope, waiting through decades of dust and decay. A cigarette butt discarded carelessly had become the one object capable of speaking when everything else had faded. The investigators who came after those first responders worked in a world Emma could never have imagined. Computers replaced typewriters. Fingerprints turned digital. DNA transformed the impossible into fact. Yet the process was still human. Detectives reading old files, comparing notes, asking questions that had once been dismissed as irrelevant. It was patience that solved her story, not luck. Detective Rachel Mendel filed her last update months after Paul Granger's conviction. Her report was brief, factual, and free of commentary. She wrote only that the case demonstrated the endurance of evidence and the persistence of human will. Then she archived the folder and walked out of the office as the sun fell across the Phoenix skyline. In Prescott Valley, the desert looked unchanged. The roads Emma had cycled along were repaved, the general store remodeled. But the landscape itself, the dry wind, the pale horizon, remained the same. To those who lived there now, her story was history. To those who remembered, it was a wound that had finally closed. Emma's sister, Lydia, received one final envelope from the Arizona Cold Case Unit. Inside was a restored photograph, the same portrait used in the investigation, now colorized for the official record. It showed Emma standing beside her bicycle, sunlight falling softly on her shoulder. For the first time, Lydia saw her sister's face as it might have looked on the day she disappeared. Alive. Ordinary. Unguarded. That image became part of the department's closing presentation. Used to illustrate how long-term evidence programs could change the course of forgotten cases. It was displayed on a single slide without commentary as an example of how truth survives delay. There were no grand speeches. No ceremonies. The story simply ended where it had begun, in the quiet of the Arizona desert, where a young woman's life had been cut short and buried under sand and time. The lessons left behind were simple. Technology evolves, but justice still depends on people willing to keep looking. Time may silence witnesses, but not the evidence they leave behind. And sometimes, even in stillness, the truth waits for someone to listen. Years later, visitors driving through Prescott Valley would sometimes stop by a small memorial near the old guest house. A plaque bore her name and one sentence beneath it. Found after 33 years, never forgotten. There were always flowers there, fresh and modest, left by people who had never met her. As the sun sank beyond the horizon, the desert wind carried the same dry whisper it always had. It passed through the brush, over the empty service road, and across the stretch of ground where Emma's story had once vanished. For decades, silence had hidden her name. But silence, like the desert, could not last forever. And as her photograph, now restored in color, shone softly on the final page of the report, The story of Emma Larkins reached its quiet conclusion. For 33 years, silence held her name. Now the desert finally spoke.